everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people out on a Thursday night interested in human rights, because in the world we live in today, sometimes it feels like human rights is a dirty word. Governments, politicians are doing anything they can to avoid the topic of human rights. I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about the attacks on human rights that we're facing at a global level, and then sort of relate that a bit to what we're seeing here in Australia. And I thought I'd talk particularly about some of the trends in counterterrorism, which we think are certainly not receiving enough attention in the mainstream media. I'm going to maybe start by just giving you a brief snapshot about Human Rights Watch, because I don't know how many of you know the work of our organisation. But very briefly, we are an international organisation. Our mandate is to investigate human rights abuses wherever they occur around the world. We publish that information through our reports, we expose these facts through the media, and then we pressure governments for change. And our methodology since we started back in 1978 has been about naming and shaming governments with the whole idea that, you know, if you call out abusive governments, that if you put the spotlight on these abuses, that they will eventually change their bad behaviour and we can hold the human rights abusers to account. But now we are facing a world where naming and shaming, it doesn't always work so well anymore. You have groups like ISIS that are proudly touting their abuses on social media. And worse, you have governments who are also touting their abuses very publicly. You have government leaders who are showing an open contempt for human rights. In the past, we had government leaders who might ignore human rights abuses, or they might fail to uphold human rights. But now, in this era of populism, whether it's Donald Trump in the United States, whether it's President Duterte killing thousands of people in the war on drugs in the Philippines, or whether it's Erdogan in Turkey rounding up tens of thousands of people, we're seeing this terrible trend happening around the world. And this I think this really represents probably the most profound challenge to the human rights movement, certainly of my generation, of this generation. And that's because, you know, when we see governments who are openly exploiting abuses like this, it makes it harder for us to name and shame them, because the governments are actually doing that already themselves. So I'm going to end tonight maybe talking a little bit about some of the new ways of working that Human Rights Watch is experimenting with in order to bring about change and hold these abusers to account. I thought, you know, maybe I'd start a little bit looking at some of the issues that we're seeing recently in Australia, and I said I'd start with counterterrorism. Just a couple of weeks ago, after the terror attack that happened in London, Pauline Hanson was she wrote a letter to Malcolm Turnbull asking for the internment of all potential terror suspects. She was saying that these people, whom there's not enough evidence for them actually to be arrested and charged with a crime, should be rounded up and kept somewhere safe away from Australians. And this really worried me. I mean, it really worried me that it got such traction in the mainstream media that I was actually having to explain to journalists why this is a bad idea. It's like we've forgotten the lessons that we should have learnt after the atrocities of World War II, when lots of people were interned, Japanese, Germans, and so on. And so, you know, we're seeing all around the world these sorts of scapegoating of minorities, whether it's Muslims, whether it's foreigners, calling out people as terrorists. And what we're finding is that the Pauline Hansons and the Donald Trumps and the Dutertes of this world are saying that human rights are really getting in the way, that human rights are only rights for terrorists or rights for asylum seekers or rights for foreigners. And the world has changed now, and we need to stamp all over those rights in order to protect the rights of the majority. Well, we need to think about, you know, why is this happening? Why in a place like the Philippines or in the United States is someone like, you know, Donald Trump or Duterte able to get power? And it's clear that there are a lot of people who feel left behind by government policies, who are disenfranchised, and who just want a change, who just want to disrupt business as usual in Washington. And so, you know, but we need to think about, I guess, the sort of devastating effects of the policies that these politicians are able to bring into effect. Of course, populist policies like this aren't anything really that new in Australia. They're not just, coming along with Pauline Hanson after the last election. But we've seen over the last few years the steady erosion of human rights and the rule of law, particularly under this government, but also with the bipartisan policy of offshore processing of asylum seekers and refugees. And I don't think I need to tell you, what is happening. I think now it's very well known, the horrible conditions that people are held on Manus Island and Nauru. I myself have been to Manus 2 years ago. In just a couple of weeks, it will be the fourth anniversary of that policy being in place. And 4 years later, people who should be at, really the forefront of their lives, they've already suffered so much in their home countries, are still stuck in these islands. And are doing no better. So, I think the Australian government in many ways has written this playbook of how to ignore when human rights abuses are brought into the spotlight, of openly touting these human rights abuses, although they don't call them abuses, as an essential ingredient in its policy of deterring other asylum seekers. But we all here very well know that under international law, you don't have the right to sacrifice the rights of a few thousand people in order to supposedly protect the rights of others who may be coming to this country. And that certainly is the line that the government has been trying to spin. But what has accompanied this policy is, again, this sort of desire to really hide the truth and to hide the facts of what is happening. That's the whole reason why people are sent to these islands, where it's very difficult and hard for organisations like Human Rights Watch and the Human Rights Law Centre to go there, where journalists have difficulty accessing, because the government really wants to hide what is going on. So refugees are certainly one scapegoat, but I think also the Muslim community is another. And this is an issue where we're seeing increasing restrictions on our civil liberties in the name of countering terrorism, but it's not getting enough attention in Australia. I mean, this is nothing new. Certainly after 9/11, we saw this in the United States and many other countries rushing to introduce very repressive counterterrorism laws. And obviously with the US abusive practices of holding people in Guantanamo Bay. Also, in China, we have seen countries like China and Russia don't need any excuse really to hold anyone who's considered a government critic on the basis of national security violations. But here in Australia, we are certainly seeing an encroachment on our rights in the name of countering terrorism. And last year, I just wanted to, sort of make you aware of a few incidences which I think have not gotten enough attention. So last year, the government passed 2 laws which Human Rights Watch has found problematic. The first one has made it easier for the Australian military to kill people in war zones because it has expanded the scope of who is considered a terrorist. So it now says that anyone who is a member of an armed group or who is facilitating members of armed groups is a legitimate combatant and can be targeted by the Australian military. And this is really problematic when you have Australian airstrikes going on right now in Mosul in Iraq, and we have many, many civilian casualties as a result of those airstrikes. Yet despite 2,000 bombs that have been dropped by the Australian airstrikes, miraculously, they say that no civilians that they're aware of have been harmed by those strikes. I mean, that would be incredible in the history of war if that were true. It would be amazing if somehow the bombs are actually able to avoid hitting civilians. But I think it's not true. And I think they're not really digging hard enough to look at who is affected. And we're also very concerned with the categorization that some of the people who previously would have been classified as civilians are now being classified as combatants, and so aren't being counted in the death toll that is being racked up. Secondly, the other law that was passed last year, which is problematic for us, is a law that allows post-sentence detention of people convicted of terrorist offences. And this is anyone who the government or a court deems to pose a risk to members of the community can be locked up for periods of time, but this can roll on, and so it can actually be indefinite detention. Now, this is problematic because, no matter what crime someone has committed, Our whole basis of our legal system is about you go to court, you have a trial, you're convicted of your crime, you serve your time, and you're let out. But now that's not going to happen anymore to terrorists who the government decides pose a threat to the people of Australia. Because once they serve their sentence, they can continue to stay in detention. And this is really problematic. Both of these policies are hugely problematic, not only because they break international law, but also this is not an effective way to fight terrorism, because this is just going to breed a new generation of recruits for ISIS, of people who are alienated and disaffected and feel like the government is not listening to them because, it's killing their family members or locking up their family members. Finally, yesterday it was actually reported in the Australian newspaper that at the G20 summit, which is happening right now in Germany, that Malcolm Turnbull is going to appeal to G20 leaders to try and find ways of combating terrorism by preventing extremist groups from using encrypted messaging. So, what this actually means is it's about creating backdoors or weakening encryption, which is really worrying to groups like us that are about supporting the rights to privacy. It sounds like a good thing. Yes, of course, we all want to prevent terrorist attacks before they happen. But those encrypted acts, they are a lifeline, not only for the Prime Minister, who does admit that he uses WhatsApp and Wickr and other apps in order to communicate about sensitive topics, because he doesn't want things disclosed, but they're also a lifeline for human rights activists in many countries, in countries like China, in Turkey, in Russia, in India. And these countries are all countries of the G20. So those leaders are going to be there when Malcolm Turnbull makes this speech about why we need to take these extreme measures to combat terrorism and weaken encryption standards. And so that's really worrying for our organisation that the government would go down this path. And these are a few issues that we are trying to generate more support and more international attention about what is going on. So, I guess what are some of the lessons we can learn from this? Well, I think, with all of these encroachments, and I think Emily's probably going to talk a little bit more about some of the encroachments in rule of law, it's almost like, we've forgotten the atrocities and the horrors of World War II, which is what actually led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being signed in the first place. That declaration came about because governments said, never again are we going to let a government scapegoat certain minorities or certain groups and have such, deadly repercussions. So human rights are universal. They apply to everyone, everywhere, and no government can take them away. And yet, we're seeing this persistent chipping away at the rights of foreigners, at the rights of Muslims, at the rights of minorities, not only in Australia, but in other countries around the world. So what do we do? How do we react in this new world? Well, despite what Donald Trump may say about facts in a post-truth world, facts still do matter. And, governments like to manipulate how facts are presented, but I firmly believe that, exposing the wrongdoing and the bad behaviour and the abuses is still really important work. But we can't just appeal to governments anymore and, point out the fact that abuses are going on, torture, killing, civilian casualties is going on, and expect governments just to do the right thing once this is pointed out to them. We actually need to mobilise people. We need to get the public on board with these messages because, the traditional naming and shaming rhetoric, it's not really working anymore. And so that's where actually all of you come in. And, what we are doing with our materials is we're realising that, it's still important for us to do the 150-page, very detailed, quite legalistic report on, say, extrajudicial killings and torture in Iraq. But we also need to put out videos. We need to share that information on social media. We need to share the stories of the victims of human rights abuses. Because ultimately, that is what really touches people, and that is what makes people say enough's enough, and compels them to take action and raise these issues with their governments. Finally, I think, the other thing that I'm concerned about is, I guess, in this world where, the US under Trump, certainly is absent from the international stage in terms of the defense of human rights. It's not like the US has always been the most amazing defender of human rights. Obviously, it has a very inconsistent and checkered record. But for a lot of victims of human rights abuses in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and China, at least the US would call out abuses where they would happen. And we need now for middle power countries like Australia, like Canada, like France, to be actually speaking up on human rights abuses. And that isn't happening. And there is an opportunity here. Australia is actually running for a seat on the UN Human Rights Council, as funny as that may sound to some of you. But Australia actually has a pretty good chance of winning that seat. So I think for all of us, we want to make sure that even if Australia doesn't get that seat, we want to see that Australia's foreign policy is one that is really centred around the protection and the defence of human rights, and that this is a guiding standard, and that it's not just about trade, and it's not just about security and prosperity and stability, but it's also about the defence of the rights of the vulnerable and the rights of those who are being abused. Thank you.